You see it also with regards to the distribution of wealth. People concentrate on this strange statistic that, the top 1% of people own a substantial proportion of the wealth. By the way, you can do that nationally, let's say. You can do that by state level, you could do it nationally or by world standards. If you make more than $32,000 a year, you're in the top 1% worldwide, which is something that the people who complain about the 1% rarely give any consideration to, because if they expanded their geographical sense, they'd understand that they're exactly the people that they're complaining about. It seems a bit arbitrary to draw the boundaries just where they happen to favor your position most particularly. But Marx observed that capital tended to accrue in the hands of a smaller and smaller number of people. And there's some truth in that, except that it's a reflection of a much broader law. And then he made a variety of mistakes as well that were crucial. One being that wealth accrued in the hands of the same people across time. Because actually what happens is the fact that 1% of the people have most of the wealth remains unchanged. But the people who make up that 1% transform quite rapidly. So most familial fortunes disappear within 3 generations. And Fortune 500 companies have an average shelf life of about 30 years. So you get that constancy of distribution, but you get quite a bit of transformation in the actual people who hold the wealth. And then it's a reflection of this broader Pareto problem, which is that a small minority of people do most of the productive work, but also accrue most of the benefit. Those aren't necessarily the same people, by the way. If the system is functioning perfectly, the most productive people also accrue the most benefit, but there's always noise, joining those two systems. Marx's fundamental mistake was to attribute that, as far as I'm concerned, was to attribute that distribution to the West, more broadly speaking, and to capitalism. And I think there's no evidence whatsoever that that's even vaguely accurate, because, first of all, because the law applies much more broadly than to merely human systems. It even applies in the case of such things as animal reproductive success, which is hardly a consequence of the pathological substructure of capitalism. And it's also the case that if you go back and analyze Paleolithic grave sites, for example, what you find is that a tiny minority of the people who were buried with all the gold. And so the evidence that inequality is built deeply into the structure of, maybe into the structure of reality itself, but certainly into the structure of social systems is overwhelming. And so the Marxist critique attributing that to some particular problem that's associated with capitalism is not only wrong, but dangerously wrong, given that capitalism and systems that are based on Western forms of governance are the only systems that also produce wealth along with inequality, right? Which is something, maybe inequality in and of itself is something that should be tempered to the degree that we're capable of doing that. But it's also important to understand that the generation of absolute wealth is also of great significance, given that that's, in the final analysis, what stops people from doing such things as starving to death. And the distribution of Western capitalist ethos, along with the emphasis on the sovereign individual, has raised the standard of living across the world in the last 100 years, and at an ever accelerating rate, at a level of magnitude and speed that's unparalleled in human history. And that's really been increasing. So I don't know if you know this or not, but hardly anybody does, but everyone should. Between the year 2000 and 2012, so let's say in the aftermath of the dissolution of the great communist systems, between the year of 2000 and 2012, the rate of absolute poverty in the world by UN standards fell by 50%. And the millennial goal was to have it by 2015, and that was accomplished 3 years ahead of schedule. And by current UN projections, there won't be a single person in the world who's living at the currently defined rate of abject poverty by the year 2030. And so, that news is overwhelmingly positive, and it seems then the evidence that degree of economic development is being sped in countries that have adopted like a classic, at least quasi-free Western attitude towards individual property ownership and business, is also extraordinarily strong.